Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. An outdated tenet of masculinity, one that I still catch myself in at times as a solopreneur, is that we as men need to do everything on our own without asking for help. It's also a myth of our broader culture, at least in the US, that an individual's hard work alone is what creates value and success. We often feel vulnerable as men, connecting with each other, asking for help, or even collaborating with someone who has shared goals and values. Good thing my next guest, 1, knows a lot about the intersection between vulnerability and masculinity, and 2, believes that our connections can actually help amplify our impact as men. Christopher Veal is the host of the Vulnerable Man podcast, in which he seeks to destigmatize the word vulnerability for men so that they can better connect with themselves and the people in their world. Christopher is a coach, a trainer of other coaches, and has been doing what he calls vulnerability interviews with men for the last 5 years. In this project, he gathers individual men's perspectives around the topic of vulnerability, and his podcast is the next extension of that project. He identifies as a father, as a friend, and as a mentor and teacher. The role of father has greatly impacted the way he relates to masculinity, and now in his spare time he helps other men prepare for fatherhood through his role as coach and facilitator for Boot Camp for New Dads. So let's see what happens when the vulnerable man meets the new masculine. Welcome, Christopher.
Very glad to be here, Travis. Wow, that was quite the introduction. I'm feeling a little flattered right now.
Oh, I hope so. I came across your work through your podcast, and I was so intrigued to connect with another man who's so singularly focused around this topic as I am, and hosting conversations with other men, just trying to get in to the inner workings of us all and find out how we relate to it. So I really appreciate you saying yes and coming on here.
Happy to be here and so glad for this conversation and actually the previous ones we've had too. So very excited.
Yeah, me too. Well, is there anything that I didn't mention in the intro about you that you think is important for the listeners to know before we jump into our conversation?
I think you did a really good job, and I'm sure if there's other elements that come up, they'll come out in our conversation.
Okay, great. I'm glad nobody's ever called me less than thorough, so I'm glad I covered it all. So the way I like to start all my conversations with men that are on this podcast is to find out what are the stories that shaped you around masculinity. What did you learn as a child growing up about what it means to be a man? What are the ways in which your beliefs have evolved over time? Just share with me any of the stories that come to mind when you think about you and masculinity.
Sure, just that small question. Probably I would say it starts back. So my parents divorced when I was 4 years old, and between when they divorced and when my dad died when I was 13, I saw him, I could count on one hand the number of times I saw him, and the number of times that were positive interactions, I don't think I could count one of them. So he really wasn't a factor in my life. So I was raised by a single mother, and I think it influenced me, obviously, because I didn't have that traditional father male role model for me. And a lot of, as I look back in my life now, the examples I looked up to were things like what I saw on television or in the movies. So that impacted kind of how I viewed what it meant to be a man. I also had my grandfather as a role model, my mother's mother, or my mother's father, if I could get that one right. And he was a farmer, came over, he emigrated from England when he was 10 or 11 years old. And, very stereotypical English man, not a lot of emotions, big heart, like cared for his family and was a hard worker, but I never really saw a lot of examples of emotion from him. And so because I spent a lot of time around him, I think some of those ideas imprinted onto me. And I don't know that I took away, like, I could never show emotion, but when I think back, I think the only time I remember ever seeing him cry was when my grandmother died. And it was briefly, and that was it. And I think between that and some of the other examples I saw, again, in the media, on TV, I started to create this idea that, yeah, I can't really have emotions, or if I have them, not to show them. And that definitely carried through for part of my life until probably well after college. Actually, later than that, I'm sure, when I really started to get curious about what this idea of being a man meant for me. That was probably the biggest one.
You mentioned that there were characters in the media and television movies that you sort of saw as models of masculinity. Are there any that come to mind that you can think of that really stood out to you from your growing up?
I don't know if there's any specific ones, but it was maybe more generic personas. So I watched a lot of TV as a kid growing up. And like, I remember even a lot of the shows, the dads would typically be kind of these goofy, awkward guys that, yeah, they love their kids, but, at the end of the day, like, they'd get the laugh track because the kids didn't die under his watch. And so that also kind of gave the message of, like, yeah, they take care of their families, but usually the message is everybody else comes first. You don't really show a lot, and you got to kind of be the rock for the family. So it was that kind of goofy, awkward, but got to be solid for everybody type of personality that I think started to influence me the most.
It's amazing how often the bar is set so low for fathers when it comes to the portrayal in television shows, that it's really about the joke and the kids surviving and very little beyond that.
Right. Yes.
Well, I think that's a really common thing that many men in our culture absorb, is that I think there are a lot of men in our culture that do have really big hearts, but unable to speak about it, unable to talk about it, unable to really navigate that big heart and the emotions that come along with it. Like you were saying with your grandfather, big heart, but not really talking about it a lot or showing those emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, in a bigger sense, I think the messaging that a lot of young boys get is, you can't do that. There's a great documentary called The Mask You Live In, done by the Representation Project.
Yes.
And, I know they talk with a lot of like at-risk youth, but the common thing that I remember when I first saw this, these messages these boys would share about what they heard, like, be a man, don't cry, don't be a girl. And how there's this, like, if you look at young kids, and boys and girls up to 3 or 4 years old, like, they're both equally likely to show emotions and cry and have the full spectrum of them. But then around 5 or 6 years old, there starts to become this messaging that little boys get about, like, you can't do that. And whether it comes from at home or at school or other areas, it starts to get reinforced. And I think that's what causes young men to grow up thinking, I can't be like that. Like, they start to categorize those type of things like sadness, or anything like that as weak. And so you can't be like that because you got to be a man. And I'm doing the air quotes, whatever the heck that means.
It's so wild how often the messages of what little boys need to be and what need to do is restrictive in nature. It's don't do that. Instead of telling boys what they should do and who they should be and positive attributes we love to see in them, it's usually about, no, don't do that. That's not what boys do.
Right. I think one of the big challenges is, and this isn't a knock on previous generations, but there was never really a lot of examples of what the range of what a man could be. I think back to like the Mad Men era, right? And what was the typical male there? He was dominant. He was assertive. He always had the right answers. He never showed emotion or never showed weakness because he was always winning the day. And so I think a lot of men saw those examples and kind of thought that's what it was, or they saw the examples of their fathers. And if their fathers weren't open showing emotions, then it wasn't likely that they were going to say, oh, it's okay for me to do that.
Yeah, totally. So sounds like you had said that by college time you started to evolve your understanding of that. Maybe is that what I heard the timeline was?
I think it probably was a little bit later. I know when I was in college, I went through a big shift. So in high school, I was really kind of a private individual. And in college, I kind of I found myself and really started to own who I was. And after college, went into the Marine Corps. And so I think that really opened my eyes to myself and my capacity. And I mean, as we're talking about this idea of vulnerability, the Marine Corps is probably not the stereotypical vulnerability crucible.
No.
So it was an interesting situation. Yeah.
I would say even matches up to pretty much the most of stereotypical traditional masculine ideals in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of the armed forces are, and I loved my time in the Marine Corps. It was, a great 9 years of my life. And what I realized early on is I wasn't that, I'm using the kind of the quotes again, like the Hollywood in your face, yell at people all the time type of leader. And not that that's what a lot of it was there, but in some areas that was kind of the expectation. And it was interesting because I'm in the Marine Corps. I found the greatest leader I've ever worked for, and also the one that I use as the don't example every time. And so I'm grateful because I got both those extremes. I always say that the one man, if he called me up today and said, "Hey, Christopher, I need you to pack your bags and meet me at such and such a place," I'd be like, "Not a problem. I'm on my way." And I wouldn't ask twice. Wouldn't care where we were going. I'd follow that man to the ends of the earth. The other guy, if he said, "Hey, I'm going to be in town next week. Want to grab coffee?" I'd be like, "Ooh, I think I'm getting my hair done that day. So maybe not."
And what other people can't see, because this is podcast, is you don't have hair.
I don't.
You'd be blaming it on that, huh?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So I won't ask you to out who these people are, obviously, but what can you help me understand what were the differences between their styles or their leadership energy that made you more receptive to one versus the other?
Sure. And I own part of it too is probably my style. But one of them, he was the example of what I'd say is like what a great father would be like. He would let you make mistakes, but his rule was learn from it and don't make the same mistake twice. So there was this safety that he created. You never want to disappoint him. The way I bottom line it is he led from a place of respect and you wanted to go above and beyond anytime he asked for anything. The other guy led from a place of authority and look at the rank on my collar. I'm the boss. And really was the way I like to put it is he would manipulate people. He liked to put people against each other because it made him feel bigger. I like to say small man syndrome. Napoleon syndrome. And that just really went against a lot of my values. And so I think that's part of the reason too we did not click. But the word that just keeps coming back to mind for me is respect. When you come from a place of respect, people will exceed your expectations. And when you come from a place of that authority or command, I'm the boss, they'll do what you say. And that's about it. And that's, I think, what really helped shape who I wanted to be as a leader and how I wanted to influence people when I left the Marine Corps and was in a leadership role in different organizations as well.
I so appreciate you giving that clear example of the different styles, because I think it is a big component of what I've been talking with my guests on this podcast and the men that I talk to in my life around how much of ways of showing up as men and as leaders in this world, the old way does have so much power and power dynamics and hierarchy placed in them, mm-hmm. and how those are used to keep some people lower, some people higher. And at least my viewpoint and the men that I'm collecting around me tend to be that more encouraged through respect and through clarity and through earning someone's respect, rather than from overpowering or dominating or taking power from someone in order to keep them in their place.
Absolutely. As you're saying that too, one thing that just hit me that I didn't notice before too was that the one that was the leader that I really admired, he was comfortable in his own skin. He was a little bit goofy sometimes, but he owned it. And that was part of what made him relatable as a human. Whereas the other guy, you always felt like he was worried about how he looked or how people perceived him. And that was more important than letting himself be real and be seen as, maybe not having all the answers or maybe being a little bit afraid sometimes.
Yeah, authenticity is such an important thing that we can all feel from each other. And when somebody's willing to show up authentically and stand in their power, like stand in their masculine identity and ask for respect and earn respect, but do it from an authentic place, it's a real human, it goes so far comparatively to the trying to control others' perceptions and trying to make sure that you stay in a level of power.
Absolutely.
So what else could you say about your journey of evolving your ideas of masculinity? It sounds like those were some pretty important moments in the Marine Corps that taught you a lot about what you do want to be and what you don't want to be as a man, as a leader in this world. How else have your perspectives around masculinity shifted?
Probably one of the other biggest examples was when I became a father. And at the time, I was working in construction as a project manager and working for a family-owned business. And when I found out I was going to become a dad, I went into the HR and said, "Hey, by the way, I'm going to be taking, paternity leave." And they had no idea what that was, and that wasn't a fault of them. Again, smaller organization, not a lot of people do. And so I kind of had to educate them on it. But when I talked with some of my peers, and a number of them were older gentlemen, but I got comments like, maternity leave, what are you doing that for? Raising kids is for women, and comments like that. And I think if I hadn't been so determined to be the father I wanted to be, I might have let that pressure get to me. And instead, those kind of comments actually set my resolve. And so in the state of California at the time, I was able to take 6 weeks of paid leave. And so I took it all. And I got some pushback from some of my coworkers. And honestly, if I could have taken longer, I would have. And I think that really was the tipping point for me around this idea, because what I knew is a job is a job and they'll come and go, but like this role of being a father, like that's forever. And, this is my one chance to influence and impact this life. And, that one you don't get do-overs on. And so I knew I was committed to that. And I was willing to let somebody think less of me. I mean, I honestly don't care. I'm not worried about a popularity contest. But I think that was a big shift for me. And when my daughter was born, I realized I want to continue to be the kind of man that she looks up to and respects, not because I'm her father, but because she sees what a man can be.
That's so powerful to hear you talk about it in that way. I don't know that I know many men that hold it in that same way. And I'm not even meaning like malintended men. I'm meaning like really good intended men. Most often the archetype that we as men embody in our culture is the provider, protector and provider. And so hearing you say that a job can come and go, but really what you wanted to be there was to care for your daughter, was to be with her, to be present, and to be able to step out of our cultural story around that your role is to provide for your child, but not necessarily provide care and quality time, and to actually honor that was a truth for you. That's super powerful to hear you talk about it that way.
Yeah. Well, the reality is there's a lot more men that want that and that are craving it.
Totally.
But like you said, there's this stereotype of, the bumbling father, and they're disengaged and don't want to be involved. Something that really helped shift my thoughts around that, there was a man named Josh Levs, who I'm a huge fan of. He wrote a book called All In, and he's been a huge champion for paternity leave and equal parenting rights for men, because it also impacts women and how men and women can co-parent and work for the benefit of our children. And that really got me on this, I guess my soapbox, I would say, about engaged fatherhood. And what I've found is there are so many guys that want to be more involved and more engaged with their children, but there's a lot of these stereotypes in the workplaces still. While it's more culturally accepted for women to take time off to raise children, for men, while they don't say it's not right, there's impacts that they suffer, like missed opportunities for promotion, or maybe they get put in different kind of groups within the organization now, and so it limits their abilities. And so as a result, a lot of men are not willing to comfortably say, hey, I need to take this time. It's shifting, and we've still got a long way to go.
Totally. It's so important that you're bringing this up, the sort of systemic, what comes about when we only leave women to do the caregiving and only leave men to do the providing and the earning money. Mm-hmm. We're looking at that as a culture right now with the pandemic that we've just been through. Women are greatly more impacted because they're staying home to tend to the children because their children are not in schools because of the pandemic. And women are already at a disadvantage in the career workforce already because they've been taking time to raise children and leaving jobs and not getting promotions. And so I love what you're talking about like if we actually provided this benefit to men too, how it actually could benefit the whole and benefit those who are disenfranchised in the work environment.
Absolutely. I mean, in the United States, we are, in terms of industrialized nations, we are down near the bottom of the leave and protected leave for fathers around caregiving. And that's just unacceptable. That's a crime.
Well, it's such an important thing that you're bringing up because I think that so much of this conversation could be about what do we need to take away from men and give to women in order to balance the scales out. And that's so often the solution creating that we do as in our human world is once we see the problem, we're like, well, I got to take from one to give to the other. There's a scarce resources. And what I hear you're offering a solution that's like give to men also, then that equals that benefits all. And then we get to raise up together rather than needing this scarcity mindset to be a part of it.
Right. I think a part of it too is like inviting the men into the conversation and not making them wrong if they say like, you know what, years ago, to say you were a stay-at-home dad, like there was the whole Mr. Mom kind of stigma that got put on it. And now there's groups of men that organize around it. Like they have a conference about it. And so it's not as mainstream as it needs to be. And it's also more accepted. And I think the more that young boys and girls see examples of men engaged and being an equal partner in parenting and like society holding them accountable that way, the more that will become the norm. And the whole, leave it to Beaver, dad goes off to work, June Cleaver stays home and tends the house. Like that will be, no, it's not acceptable. We won't let that happen.
Totally. So I also hear in your story that you really valued being there and being present for your daughter. And in some ways you really had to teach yourself what being a father was. You didn't really have a father figure.
Right.
What was that process like for you?
So the short version is like, I just made sure that everything that I experienced, I did the opposite of. And let me be clear. I'm not berating my father. I'm sure he did the best he could. And what I knew is there were so many broken promises that I'd had growing up that like I wanted to make sure it wasn't about presence with a TS at the end of it. It was about presence with a CE at the end of it for my daughter. And so that's really what I've held on to is how can I be present in her world? I make sure every day, every time I talk to her, that I tell her I love her because I want her to know that and that she is a priority in my life. And so that's really helped me shape how I want to show up as a father. I don't know about any other parents. Mine did not come with an instruction manual, so it's kind of a figure it out as you go. And I've made mistakes. And part of what I've appreciated is I've been willing to own that with my daughter and say, you know what? All right, Papa messed up there. I didn't quite get it right, and I'm doing my best. So hopefully we can work through this. And she's been great. She's like, hey, Papa, you're doing great. But I'm not afraid to let her see when I stumble sometimes because I don't want her to also think that you can never make mistakes.
Yeah, presence with a CE rather than a TS. I'm into that little phrase. How old is your daughter?
She's 11 now. She'll be 12 in July.
Oh, this is such an important time, I think, for little girls to be experiencing their dads. Mm-hmm. That we're in such a weird point in our culture where we've sort of made it through like the intense versions of the Me Too movement where we've been having conversations about power dynamics and sexual assault in our culture. And we've sort of been distracted by a global pandemic and racial unrest and political unrest in our country for a little while. But there's such an importance to little girls seeing a father, seeing their presence, seeing a man they can be proud of and having models of what men are in this world that are not what we've been seeing portrayed in the media because we've been needing to unearth so much shadow.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we are starting to see a shift in being a little more accepting of men having a little more range and showing more emotions. What I've found the irony is when you talk to people, and I'll talk to people like most relationships, they'll say they want their man to have more vulnerability, to show more vulnerability. But then the messaging that we hear everywhere is don't do that, right? Like you said, like we get a lot of messages of don't be angry, don't be all these things. And so it's stifle, stifle, stifle. And so then it's like, how do we be with all this stuff? Because we're human. Like we will have emotions. And I believe we need to help all people, not just boys and men, learn how to be with emotions, because then they can more easily go through us and we can manage them and be more respectful human beings and better citizens of society.
I couldn't agree more. Where the real work around this piece where you and I agree is that the emotional literacy, the ability to move through emotions, be present with emotions, not be afraid of them, not stuff them, but just actually be with them and let them inform our experience, I think is such an important part of our evolution as men.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were asking too before about some of the things that influenced my journey too. And I mean, obviously Brene Brown was a large part of that. I discovered her TED Talk on vulnerability several years ago. And that kind of like, there was already the fertile ground for it to happen. And when that landed and took seed, that's what cracked me open. Around that same time, I did a year-long leadership program. And that was really the catalyst for me of shifting the work that I was doing. And that really yielded the things you were talking about, the vulnerability interviews that I call them. Because what I realized is in that year-long journey of the program I was in, I was coming into my own vulnerability that I had been resisting for so long. And when I did that, I realized I want to be able to create space for other men to be able to do that too, and make it safe for them to do so.
So tell me more about these vulnerability interviews and what you've been doing over the last 5 years with them.
The short version is I ask men for 30 minutes of their time, and I have 5 core questions that I ask them. And it really is just a dialogue around that. And it's around the subject of vulnerability and what gets in the way and what their experiences have been. And what I've found is each man that I talk to, there are so many common themes that they encounter. And like they often say the reason they don't want to be more vulnerable is because they're afraid of being seen as weak or less than. And then I say to them, and if a good friend of yours came to you and shared something that he was struggling with, what would you think of him? And their answer is typically, oh my God, I'd be proud of him for sharing it with me, or I'd have a lot of respect. And then I just sit back and I wait. And I would play the little Jeopardy music in my head, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, and the light goes on for them, right? Like we hold ourselves in a much more critical light than our friends ever would. And so I think even just having those conversations is helping to shift their perspective a little bit. And my hope is then it shifts how they show up in their relationships with their male friends and with other people in the world.
That's so in line with what I see as part of your magic in the world. And it's so aligned with the kind of coaching mindset, which is to open up a dialogue, be curious about somebody, ask questions, and that process develops something new in somebody rather than going in and telling them how they should live their lives as men. You're actually just asking questions that help them develop a self-awareness in themselves.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as we've been talking about, as men, we get so many messages of how we should be. And so for me to come in and say, you need to do this, that's going to be just one more message they tune out. So I get curious, and honestly, like, I love them. I love on them and hold that space for them.
Which is such a powerful place that you hold for men, because I don't know that most men get that space in their lives to have somebody be genuinely curious about their inner workings and to just be loved on in that process, and to not be told you're wrong for having that perspective or believing that, but just actually being really non-judgmental and curious about them is super powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, and most importantly, I think, is not trying to fix them. Like when that man opens up and says, hey, here's something I'm struggling with, not going, oh, here's what you should do to fix it, but just being with them and be like, yeah, that's got to be hard. And not the, oh, I had a similar story type of thing. There's real power in just witnessing people, right? I mean, I know we're talking about men. It applies to all people, but I think it can be really powerful for men because we often we don't have that permission to do it. And so the more that men can see it and create that for themselves, I think the easier it becomes to step into it.
Yeah, I think we can be so easily lulled into this pattern of problem, solution as men. And so a man is sharing something that's vulnerable for them. That's the problem. Now give them the solution. How many partners of men romantic partners of men have said, I don't want you to fix this. I just want you to listen. I just want to feel heard. And the gift that you're giving is to actually model that space for the men as you're having these conversations.
Absolutely. I think when we talked last, I shared that video. It's not about the nail, right? Like, it's so typical that as men, like, we do want to fix things. And one of the things that I took away from my marriage is I got to the point of saying, hey, you're bringing something and help me be with you in this. Do you want me to just listen, or do you want me to help solve it? And that was powerful for me, because then it helped me know which space did she need me to be in. And it allowed me to like then fully be there, so that I wasn't going to problem solving when she didn't want that, or vice versa. And I think that's a really good lesson for everybody to learn, but especially guys and the people that are the problem solvers.
Can we break that down a little bit more and actually understand what that process was like for you to actually integrate that new awareness that sometimes it's not about finding a solution, it's just about listening and being with your partner? Like, how did you learn that new skill, and how did you deal with your own discomfort of just sitting there being with her instead of giving her a solution?
The honest answer, I had to bang my head against a wall a lot. I realized like that's the God's honest truth. Particularly because of my time in the Marine Corps. Like, in the Marines, it's about mission accomplishment. Something here's the plan you're going to do, and then something comes up that causes you to detour. So figure out how do you work around it. Like we used to say, improvise and adapt, and you'll get there. And I realized that was how I was showing up a lot of ways, particularly in my relationship with my now ex-wife. And what I realized is we were constantly kind of like, not butting heads, but we were missing each other in communication. And I realized it was because a lot of the time I was going to problem solving, because when she would bring something, it would sound like it was an issue that she was dealing with. And I finally, I don't know necessarily what the thing was that helped me shift it. It might have been that leadership program too, but something in me, like I said, you know what? I'm trying to solve this right now, and it feels like that's not what you need. And she was like, no, I don't need you to solve it. I just need to listen. I said, awesome. And so I listened in that moment. And the next time she came to me with something, I said, let me just check something. Do you need me to listen, or do you need me to problem solve? And so it kind of was something that I just threw out, and I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work or not. And what it did, I found, is like really honored what she was needing in the moment. And so I started using it in a lot of aspects of my life. I'm one of those people that like everyone comes to with stuff that's going on, and I never give advice. I've always avoided. But I like to just say, so what do you need from me in this? Like, how can I be of service? And it helps frame it. And for me, I think it's great because it honors the person and helps them sometimes get clear on what do they need, so that we can make this interaction valuable. So I don't know if that explains it for you.
It absolutely does. I'm so appreciative of that offering, because I think that more men need to be doing that in their relationships, is asking that question. Do you need me to listen, or do you need me to problem solve? What do you need in this moment?
Yeah. The other side of it too is, I think as men, we sometimes need to say that too, right? Like, I've got guy friends, and sometimes I just need to vent about something. And I got one buddy who's like, oh yeah, well, here's what you do. And I'm like, no, dude, hold on. I don't need you to do anything with it. I'm capable of fixing it. I just need you to listen so I can get it off my chest. And he's like, okay. So I'd also say for men, like, be willing to do that too, because when you ask for what you want, it's less frustrating because people know what you need and they can meet you there.
Yeah, we totally need to do it with each other as men. Even my partner and I'm a gay man in a gay male relationship, and even we are still, as much as we have sort of freed ourselves from the traditional masculine box, we also still were patterned and were raised in a culture that taught us these things. And so we had a conversation this weekend where I started asking questions that were leading towards a solution on something, and he was like, that's not what I needed right now, and now you're just upsetting me.
Right. And your intent was to help, but it actually made it worse.
Totally. And so it's really about slipping back, and I think if we can practice that with each other as men, whether you're in romantic relationships with men or just friendships with men, practice having those kind of conversations with each other. I think it's really important, because not everything needs to be fixed. Sometimes people just need to spend some emotional energy and let it flow and say what they need to say. And they'll feel better on the other side of it.
Right. Well, I think that ties back to what we started talking about with the emotions, right? Sometimes as men, because we don't necessarily get taught how to be with emotions, we get uncomfortable when some of them come up, like joy and happiness and laughter. Those ones are easy to be with. But when somebody is sad and crying and distressed, like we don't know what to do with it. And so we want to go to fixing it, and being able to just be with them in it can be really powerful. So I think that's also a way that we can honor others, is let them be in their stuff. And, again, I'm a big advocate of it. If somebody starts crying, I'm not going to hand them a box of tissue. Like, they are completely capable. If they need it, they'll say, can I have one? The message that sometimes gets conveyed if you give them a tissue is, you need to stop crying, right? So I really want to be conscious of what's the message and the intention that I'm portraying.
Yeah, I totally learned that when I started becoming a facilitator and coach. Whenever a client in front of me has started crying, I never reach for the box, right? Because you don't want to interrupt the flow. Sometimes it blocks what naturally wants to happen. There's an intelligence and a wisdom to our bodies, to our emotional expressions, that people need the ability to let it flow. And if you interrupt it by, even with caretaking sometimes, it doesn't necessarily serve the highest good. And so sometimes being able to just sit in your own discomfort while watching somebody else be uncomfortable is a really powerful, powerful practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And when we stifle others, it keeps them in those emotions too, so that they can't flow through them.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's what we do as men, is we stuff it, or we get them blocked in there, and then we never deal with them. And so we end up projecting that out and recreating that in other people's lives. But if you can just let it flow, sometimes that's the best thing to do. What's your practice when you feel uncomfortable, if your partner or your friend is having some sad emotions and you're struggling to feel like you want to fix it, but really they need to just be heard? What's your practice of sort of self-soothing?
I think what I do is I just check in with myself. If I'm starting to notice discomfort, like I ask myself, is it my own discomfort, or is it because of the situation? And that's where I start. And usually it's my own stuff. And what I do then is, like, I just kind of take a breath, and then I focus back on that other person. That's most likely what I do, because I've started to build this muscle so much. Doesn't mean I always get it right, but most of the time that helps me get back and connect with the person. If there's something coming up that's like really triggered me, like I might just say, you know what, can I just say something to clear it? Because it's getting in the way of me being really here present for you. And like saying, you know what you said, like, I just noticed it really kind of had me spin off, and I just needed to say that, and like now we're back. But I get to own my piece of it too, and then I'm not holding on to it or trying to push it aside, which is keeping me distracted. So I think it really comes down to, you have to have a conscious awareness, which takes practice, and then you got to be willing to say, okay, I'm willing to put my crap aside for right now because I want to be here in service of this person.
Well, I love what you just offers that sort of nice balance where it's not about self-sacrifice and I need to hold back my feelings so this person can just flow in emotion. Like, you can honor what's true for you. Let me just put this out here just so I can set it aside. Then I'm back here for you. Mm-hmm. So that both people matter and are important in the conversation. It's not just one person stuffing themselves, trying to leave space for the other. So I really appreciate that there is a balanced way to do that, where if you need to say something, say it so that it's out there. Couch it in that, let them know that it's just, I need to let this out, and now I'm back. It's a great way to do it.
Well, and sometimes it's even just in my own head saying, oh, this is what's bothering me. And by having that thought, it allows me to let it go too. So it depends on the situation. Like, sometimes I will articulate it out loud. Sometimes I can just in my head go, oh, this is what's in my way. And that lets me free of it too. So there's, range of how you can do it.
Totally. So what else have you learned from your vulnerability interviews with men? You've been doing them for a while. You've been in that curiosity space with men, and it seems like you've evolved it to now even be in a podcast form in The Vulnerable Man. Tell me a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, there's just so much. The one common thread is that there are a lot of men that want to be more vulnerable and want permission and feel safe enough to do it. For me, when I started it, I initially thought this is going to be hard. Like, there's nobody talking about this. How am I going to find guys that want to talk about this? And what I've learned is there are a lot of men that are willing to, and even more men that are doing some of this work, right? Like yourself. And it was actually last May. I was doing a vulnerability interview with a man, and halfway through the conversation, I realized I need to do a podcast. I knew nothing about podcasts, but like something hit me and said, I'm talking to one man at a time with these interviews, and I love it. And if I want to make this message go viral, I need to be talking to more men and sharing more men's stories. And so that's really where the genesis of the podcast came from. And again, like the fear voice came in, like, what do you know about podcasting? So I'm like, all right, I'm willing to put myself out there and say, hey, to my network, I don't know what I'm doing. Somebody help me. And of course, people were willing to step forward. And then it was like, oh, how am I going to find guests? Because nobody wants to talk about this. And of course, there's a ton of men that want to. And what I've loved about the journey the most is I've connected with a lot of amazing men that are doing similar work. And it's made me realize I'm not alone in this. Like, we are a growing army of men, and there's women supporting it too, that are wanting to help men feel safe in this. So it's been really eye-opening and humbling for me as a journey.
That feels so similar to what I've gotten out of this, out of hosting my podcast, was I felt a little isolated and alone. Like I had this sort of personal mission that I was going to accomplish in sort of disrupting outdated models of masculinity. And it was like, that kind of feels like a lot on my shoulders.
Right.
That feels a little burdensome. And I, in the exploration and just showing up for these conversations and just getting curious about who would join me for it, I've similarly found that same collaborative energy and finding more men with similar values and goals. And I'm just so grateful to be able to collaborate in this way with you, because it breaks that rule that I talked about in the intro to this podcast, which is that we as men have to do it all alone.
Right. And I think that's one of the challenges that we put on ourselves. Like, we hold on to this, I got to do it alone. At first I thought, oh, I got to get this all figured out. And then I was like, hey, Christopher, get out of your own head, get out of your own way. You have people that want to help you. Just ask. And that in itself was an act of vulnerability. And when I did, I'm like, oh yeah, look at how my world has got me when I do it. And the men that I talk to, like, what I love is hearing their stories, and everyone's journey is a little bit different, but there's that common theme of when we find connection, when we find our community, like, we realize, oh yeah, I'm not alone. And even though your story isn't exactly like mine, I can identify with you. And so that helps me connect a little more with you and creates more humanity.
Well, yeah, in the words of Brené Brown, it's like the vulnerability is what helps us feel safer and connected to each other. It's when we hold back our vulnerability that we don't actually feel safe with each other and we can't really fully connect. The vulnerability is what binds us and connects us.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the common humanity that we have.
So a key thing you brought up was this piece around men are seeking permission to be vulnerable. What have you found are ways that you can provide permission to men to do so? How you've been doing these interviews for a long time. Now you're hosting a podcast. What are your ways of giving permission to men to be vulnerable?
I think the biggest way I can do it is just the way I show up and be willing to be vulnerable with strangers, with people I don't know, when it's uncomfortable. So I teach coach training courses as well. And one of the things I've realized is that when I'm willing to let myself really be vulnerable, it creates space for everybody in the room, not just men. And also in just my interactions with people. Now, I'm not necessarily the first time I'm going to meet you, tell you my deepest, darkest secrets and bare my soul, but I'm usually the one that's willing to open up a little bit more first. And I'm okay with that, because even if that other man doesn't reciprocate it, what I know is I've planted a seed. And so maybe not with me, but maybe somewhere else in his life, he might be willing to maybe let the walls down a little bit, let down his guard. And that will start the process. So I'm really looking at it as like a long game, and I'd love for it to happen a whole lot sooner, but I'm patient.
I was just going to say, whoa, it sounds like someone's comfortable playing the long game.
Yes. Yeah. And I want it to happen sooner too.
Totally. Yeah. It's amazing to be in that space when you see that freedom actually show up, freedom to be vulnerable with another man.
Yeah. I think another thing that's a factor too is when I recognize that another man is starting to be vulnerable with me, I'm really cautious about how I respond. And I want to make sure that I'm not responding in a way that comes across as judgmental or may shut him down. Like, I really keep a hard focus on how do I help keep this space feel safe for him. Because when, in my experiences, when men feel a little bit more safe, they're more willing to do it. And it's like that idea, right? Like when you step out of your comfort zone a little bit and it doesn't kill you, your comfort zone grows a little. And so over time it compounds and ultimately then they might be willing to be more vulnerable with other people in their lives. And that's really what the hope is it just kind of has this domino effect and it starts to ripple outwards. That was two crazy metaphors that don't necessarily go together, and that's okay.
I tracked it the whole time. And I'm actually really glad you brought it up because I think there is this importance to, if we're going to be encouraging men to be vulnerable, the response that they receive in those moments when they test the waters, when they try it out, is just as important as their effort to step into that vulnerability and be brave is just as important as the response they receive for that man, because that man is conditioned to not want to be vulnerable and to be on alert for how this is going to go wrong.
Right. And I think you need to be aware of like acknowledging the fact that they were willing to step into that a little bit too, right? Don't make a big deal about it, but like just acknowledge, I appreciate you were willing to share that with me. Or, thank you for letting me in on that. That can be powerful in reinforcing that message for them too.
Yeah, a total artwork of being able to provide enough acknowledgement without overwhelming the system, without overexposing them in feeling really vulnerable and receiving all that praise for something,
right?
Or being doted on or taken care of as a result of their vulnerability.
Right. Yeah, again, they don't need fixing. They're okay. It's okay to have their emotions, like even reminding them of that, because I don't think men often hear it, right? Like, again, I come back to the media. You look at the action hero in the movie, his best friend dies and he wipes away a single tear and then goes and kills all the bad guys and wins the day and gets the girl. So what message does that send to boys and men? You got to be tough and stoic. Don't have emotions because winners and champions don't do that.
So I'm really curious about, because you and I both teach for coach trainings, we're teaching other coaches how to be coaches and how to be really successful in their work. I'm really curious about this concept that you and I both work in a pretty female-dominated career. It's pretty female-dominated in the recipients, the clients of life coaches, but also within the life coaches, the profession itself. And I'm always really fascinated personally about how do we lower the barriers to entry for men so that more men can do this self-reflection piece, that can do the personal development. And I think part of it is this vulnerability thing. It's vulnerable to ask for help or to have somebody else know what's going on in your life and being able to support you with it and to receive help. But how do you see it, or what do you see are some of the ways that we can lower the barriers to entry and actually invite more men into this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You must be a coach. One of the things that comes to me is I think giving them exposure to it. Up until I was working on my master's, I didn't know what coaches were. I thought of coaches and I thought of sports like most people do. And I think helping men understand that like things like coaching, it comes from the place of like, you're not broken, you don't need fixing. And I think even normalizing the idea around therapy too, right? Like this is not a small piece. This is a piece of a much bigger challenge, but normalizing this idea that like you can have feelings. You don't always have to have the answers. Several years ago, like I went to therapy and I was like, I needed that. I needed somebody who was outside of my situation to be able to talk to and have, neutral opinion that wasn't going to tell me I'm good or bad or right or wrong. And I found that really powerful. And I've had other guys that I know like say to me, oh, you went to therapy? I'm like, yeah, like it was very helpful for me to be able to just talk and not have to worry about that person has an agenda. And I think, so this is a really wrong way because I don't know what I'm thinking until I finish talking. It's about normalizing that it's okay to do that. That, as men, we don't have to have all the answers. As a matter of fact, I have more respect for a man who says, you know what, I don't know, but I'm willing to work to figure it out, as opposed to somebody who says, oh no, I got the answers. And we all know, no, you don't. You're just BSing us. So like normalizing that you can be human. Like, I guess that's really it. You can be human and we're not going to think less of you for it.
So there's two things I hear in there that I really want to highlight, which is part of it's the normalizing going to therapy, normalizing life coaching. And I think a big piece of it that you pulled out that I always say to the men that are considering working with me is, how often do you get a space to talk to somebody about what's going on in your life where I'm not invested in any of the decisions you make? You could make any of those decisions and I won't be impacted or hurt or need anything from you in that process. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting relationship that most people don't get to have in their lives. Your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your kids, they all need something from you and are impacted by the decisions you make. In the therapeutic or a coaching relationship, you get this blank space to where the coach or the therapist really don't have needs that really mattered in that relationship. It's really just about you and helping you find truth in yourself. So I always think that that's a really powerful thing for men to realize, is that this could be a really interesting place for you to be more exploratory and figure out what you're needing and wanting in the situation, where you don't have to worry about my reaction to something.
Absolutely. That, again, the thing that keeps coming back to me is like giving them permission or letting themselves give themselves permission. I don't know if that sentence makes sense, but like helping them find their way to say it's okay. And, I'm not perfect. Like I jokingly say, I don't strive to be perfect. The last man that was, he got hung on a cross. I don't aspire to that. So let me be flawed and perfectly human, because that's part of what makes us unique and, to me, so interesting.
Yeah, and that's the second piece I wanted to highlight, which is there's this reframe around not knowing the answers or being perfect that we as men sometimes try to avoid not knowing the answer, or we try to lean into being perfect all the time. Mm-hmm. And a recent guest on the podcast really talked about this concept of beginner's mind and the power of beginner's mind.
Absolutely.
When we let ourselves be in the I don't know, but I'll figure it out, there's so much more potential and so much more options that could happen. When we say I know, there's only one way in that way. When we're in that expert mind, I know, and this is the one way to do it. But beginner's mind leaves out so much possibility and potential that otherwise would be left untapped. And so I think there's this nice reframe in there around owning beginner's mind, rather than sort of you need to always know the answer, or you need to not know the answer and just deal with that insecurity that comes along with it.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the problem too is most of the structures we have in like the work settings, they support this. You've got to have the answer and find a solution. And so you almost get reinforced on a regular basis, like I've got to know, or I'm not being successful. And what helps me really be grounded is, like, I like to say we are way smarter than I could ever be. So like, why wouldn't I tap into the collective wisdom and say, you know what, I don't know, because 99.9% of the time I get a way better solution than what I might have initially thought was the answer.
And I just think that I've grown so much in those moments when I've been able to say, I don't know. Even you saying with you developing your podcast, of being able to say to your community, I don't know how to do this. Who does know how to do that? Mm-hmm. Like, you got, not only did you get the information you needed, but you got care, you got a sense of community, a sense of like, oh, I've really built a group of people that help me along the journey. I'm not alone in this.
Right. I think one of the big lessons I've learned too is, like, people want to help. And quite often everybody, not just men, are afraid to ask because we don't want to be a burden. And like somebody helped me kind of shift my perspective, because I love being of service to people. Like, most of my emails, I sign off, let me know if there's any way I can be of service, or that's how I end a lot of my conversations. And somebody said to me, someone just offered to help you and you said no. And that's kind of like throwing away a gift. And I was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you offered to help somebody and they said no, how would you take it? I'm like, well, I wouldn't be offended, but I know I could have helped them. And they were like, so then why wouldn't you let somebody help you? And I'm like, oh, that's one of those spiritual kicks in the head that I'm really going to hate in a couple days. And so that was a big shift for me, because it's like, if I'm so eager to help others, why don't I let them help me? And that really helped me get to the point of saying, you know what? Okay, I don't know, and please help.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lesson I still have to learn sometimes in my own life. I think in being a coach, I sometimes get in like the identity of I am a life coach and I help people work on their lives and improve their lives. And like that identity becomes something that actually becomes very limiting to me. It's like, I'm not allowed to be vulnerable with in my life and not know what to do and not know how to navigate a global pandemic.
Right. Like, I have all these tools. I should know how to do it. I help my clients. Like, yeah, but I'm human. Sometimes I can't get out of my own way too.
Exactly. And I see myself doing that to myself all the time, where I lock myself into that identity. I think that's such an important part of the thing that we do as men, is we hang our hat on a coat hook of a certain identity, and then we get stuck in that, and it limits us at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
I think all people can do that, but I think we as men are even more identity driven, external identity driven, how we're seen in the world by a certain role we play. And I think it's so easy to get lulled into not actually being vulnerable and a real human when we over-identify with a role rather than the human being that we are.
Yeah.
So I know we both value modeling vulnerability between as men, and not just preaching it, but actually being a part of it. I heard you in a previous conversation share with me that you're writing a book in the next year. Are you willing to go a little vulnerable with me and tell me about that?
I knew I shouldn't have told you that. Okay, yeah.
Watch out what you tell me.
I know. Yep. Yeah. So what I've realized is the last couple of years I've been kicking around this idea, and it's time to do it. So it's a book that's based on a lot of the things that I've learned from my conversations with these men doing these vulnerability interviews. And it's also going to kind of be part of my journey too. And so my hope for it is that it will kind of be a way to share some practical experiences and some tips and stories from myself and other men around this topic, and, hopefully help some men find their way to it as well.
Where are you at in that process?
I am right now kind of fleshing out, what it will look like and collecting stories and stuff. So my goal is that it will be written before the end of the year. And then if all goes well, it'll be published. If not by the end of the year, then early next year. So you can hold me accountable to that.
Oh, I'm so into this. I wanted us to have a vulnerable moment on the podcast, since that's such our value system. And you and I both know that we as coaches love some accountability.
Yeah. Well, listen, and that's part of what helps hold you accountable, right? So, I mean, I appreciate you doing it, because it's also reminded me the more people in my world that I tell, the more likely I am to do it. So, yes.
Well, I think your work is so important. I think you have been doing this long enough and have gathered enough stories and have gotten enough perspectives around this that you have something important to share. And we're at a really pivotal point as men, as in masculinity, where things need to change. It's not sustainable the way we're moving forward. And I wanted to bring you out on this because, first, I'm excited about the work you're doing. Second, I know that telling more people helps spin the energy more and helps you more inclined to keep moving forward on it. And I just think the world needs it. And so I'm just really grateful that you are willing to move through that vulnerability and share something that's in the works. That's not perfect yet. That's not there yet. That isn't even fully manifested yet. I think that can feel so vulnerable to say something like that.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate it, because what I also realize is, I struggle with imposter syndrome sometimes, right? Like, who am I to write a book? Who's going to want to read it? And even just hearing that, it's like, oh yeah, like, it's not about, I have to write a New York Times bestseller, because that's what my saboteur is going to want me to think. Like, I'm going to write this book, and, that's the goal. If it has success, great, but there's power in it. And, you're mentioning speaking it out loud, like, that's part of what had me do my TED Talk. Right? Like I said to my coach one day, I want to do a TED Talk, and it scared the crap out of me to say it. And then I realized I'm going to make it happen. And it did, it took work, but there is absolute power in, like, speaking your goals, the things you want to accomplish, and then letting people help hold you accountable, because they're doing it from a place of love.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, count me up as a part of your community of, if you need anything in that process, you reach out and let me know. I'm happy to support in whatever way I can in helping you get that realized. Take that from your clarity that you have internally and bringing it externally out into the world. I really want to support that. So let me know if anything does come up.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And look, once it's out there, then you get to come back on the New Masculine, and we get to promote the book on here.
There you go. All right. Sounds like a plan.
We've already got a promo deal going. Well, it's been really wonderful to connect with you today. I'm so grateful that we got to do this collaboration. The way that I'd love to sort of land this together is to find out from you if there's one piece of advice that you would give to men, what would that be?
Just that small question. Well, before I answer that, I do want to say I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing as well, Travis. Yeah, I always love encountering more allies wanting to shift the perspective on things. And so, like I consider you a brother in arms, and I'm so grateful and look forward to future collaborations.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the first thing that comes to mind is just reach out and be willing to let your guard down. People are going to receive you, and it will rarely, if ever, be as bad as you're making it up to be in your mind. And it may not go as wonderfully as you'd hoped either, but you've still grown as a result. So, you know what? I'm going to steal a line. There was a gentleman named Matt Kirshner that I interviewed recently, and he had this line of go first. And I think that's what I really want to say. Don't spend your days wondering, what if I was willing to be more open? Try it. It's not likely you're going to regret it. And most likely what's going to happen is you're going to have better connections with the people in your life because they want more of you. They need more of you to show up. So go first. And, we got your back. You're not alone.
Oh, so here for all of that. Go first and you're not alone. And I also really appreciate that you brought that piece in, that it may not go as perfectly as you thought the first time. Don't use that as an excuse to not try again and to not open again. Some people can't hold it. That's okay. That's more about them than it is about you. So I'm so here for that. Go first. Thank you for all of the wisdom that you've shared today. Thank you for bringing all of your experience and all the different portions of your life that have led you to this place. And I'm so excited for the book coming in late 2021, early 2022, maybe?
Yeah.
So if people wanted to get in contact with you and find out more about the work you're doing in the world, find out about this book as it's going to come out in the future, how might they do so?
Sure. So the podcast is The Vulnerable Man, and that website is vulnerable-man.com. That's where you can find that. You can also find my coaching website at datitudecoach.com. I am the Chief Datitude Officer. And in early March, I'm going to be launching a new one called Echelon Left, which will be echelon-left.com. And my email right now is Christopher@datitudecoach. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. I don't do a lot of the social media, but I have to have a presence. So I'm there, but drop me an email. That's the best way to get hold of me. Okay, great. Well, I'll make sure to put all of those links in the show notes so that people can easily access them. If people want to get in contact with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram and post a lot about the New Masculine at Travers03. And if you're interested in supporting the mission of the New Masculine, you can go to patreon.com/thenewmasculine and become a contributor. I'm so grateful that you joined me today, Christopher. It's been a real pleasure to collaborate with you and to be a brother in arms around this shared mission. Like we both have said, it's just so nice to not be doing it alone and to be standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody who believes the same things and that has the same values and goals around this transition that we need to push along in our world. Absolutely. And I'm so grateful for you. And just like you offered, if there's any way I can be of service, do not hesitate to reach out because I know we're going to stay connected and there's lots of great work for both of us. Totally. Thank you so much for that offering.